The wind cut through Jake Morrison's coat like 1,000 frozen knives as he guided his horse through the blizzard that had descended upon the Texas plains without warning, turning what should have been an easy ride back to San Angelo into a fight for survival. He had been checking the fence lines on the northern edge of his ranch when the storm hit, and now visibility was reduced to mere feet as the snow swirled around him in angry white clouds. His horse whinnied nervously, its breath forming great plumes of vapor in the frigid air, and Jake was about to turn toward what he hoped was south when he spotted something dark against the white landscape. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree or perhaps an animal seeking shelter, but as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. It was a person, small and curled into a tight ball, half buried in the snow that had already accumulated. Jake dismounted immediately, his boots sinking into the deep powder as he rushed forward. The figure was a young woman, her lips blue with cold, her dark hair crusted with ice. She wore deerskin clothing that would have been adequate in milder weather, but against this unexpected January storm of 1878, it offered little protection. Jake did not hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, alarmed at how light she was, how her body felt like ice even through his gloves. She was Apache. He could tell from her clothing and the distinctive patterns on her dress, and he knew that her people had been driven from much of their land, scattered and struggling to survive. Whatever had brought her out here alone in this weather, she would surely die if he did not act quickly. He managed to get her onto his horse, holding her against his chest as he mounted behind her. His ranch house was still miles away, too far to risk in this storm, but he remembered passing an old line shack about a mile back. It was rough shelter, used occasionally by cowboys during cattle drives, but it would have 4 walls and a roof, and that was all that mattered right now. The ride to the shack felt like an eternity. Jake held the girl close, trying to share what warmth he had, though he knew he was growing dangerously cold himself. When the dark outline of the small structure finally appeared through the snow, relief flooded through him. He dismounted carefully, holding the girl securely, and kicked the door open. The interior was sparse but dry, with an old potbelly stove in the corner and a few rough blankets left from previous use. Jake laid the girl on the floor as gently as he could, then immediately set about building a fire. His fingers were stiff with cold, making the task difficult, but years of experience guided him. He had kindling and matches in his saddlebag, always prepared for emergencies, and soon he had flames crackling in the stove. Only then did he lead his horse into the shack. The space was cramped with the animal inside, but the horse's body heat would help warm the small room, and he could not leave the faithful creature outside to freeze. He turned his attention back to the girl. Her breathing was shallow, her skin frighteningly cold. Jake knew that warming her too quickly could be dangerous, but leaving her in those wet clothes would mean certain death. With as much respect as he could manage, trying not to think of the impropriety, he removed her frozen outer garments and wrapped her in the dry blankets. He rubbed her hands and feet gently, trying to restore circulation, then positioned her near the stove, close enough for warmth but not so close that she might burn for hours. Jake tended to both the fire and the girl, watching anxiously for signs that she might wake. He melted snow in an old tin cup he found in the shack, letting it warm by the fire so he would have water ready when she could drink. The storm raged outside, howling around the shack's walls, but inside the small space gradually grew warmer. As night fell, the girl finally stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and she made a small sound of confusion. Jake moved closer but not too close, not wanting to frighten her. Her eyes opened slowly, dark and disoriented, and when she saw him, fear flashed across her face. She tried to sit up, pulling the blanket around herself, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar space. "Easy now," Jake said softly, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "You are safe. I found you in the snow. You would have died out there." She stared at him, clearly not understanding his words. She spoke then, a rapid stream of Apache that Jake could not comprehend. He shook his head slowly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. He picked up the cup of warm water and held it out to her, miming drinking. She watched him warily for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took the cup. She drank carefully at first, then more eagerly, the water clearly soothing her parched throat. When she handed the cup back, her expression was still guarded, but some of the fear had left her eyes. "My name is Jake," he said, pointing to himself. "Jake Morrison." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then she pointed to herself and spoke a word that sounded like music to his ears, though he could not quite catch all its syllables. Seeing his confusion, she tried again, slower. "Siki." "Siki," Jake repeated, and she nodded. "That is a pretty name." They sat in awkward silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Jake pulled some jerky from his pack and offered it to her. She accepted it with a small nod of thanks and ate slowly, her eyes never leaving him. He ate some himself, knowing he needed to maintain his strength. The storm continued outside, and he knew they would be stuck here at least until morning, possibly longer. As the night wore on, exhaustion caught up with both of them. Jake positioned himself on the opposite side of the shack, giving Siki as much space as possible. He pulled his coat tight around himself and leaned against the wall, the cold seeping through the thin barrier. Sleep came in fits and starts, and each time he woke, he checked the fire and glanced at Siki to make sure she was still breathing. Sometime in the darkest part of the night, he woke to find her sitting up, watching him. Their eyes met across the dim space, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps. She gestured to the blankets wrapped around her, then to him shivering in his corner. She held out one of the blankets. Jake hesitated. It seemed improper, but he was so cold his teeth chattered, and he knew that hypothermia could be as deadly as the storm outside. He moved closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and accepted the blanket gratefully. They sat together in silence, the warmth of the fire washing over them, and eventually both drifted into a deeper sleep. Morning brought a break in the storm. Jake woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the cracks in the shack's walls. Siki was already awake, standing by the small window, looking out at the transformed landscape. Everything was buried under several feet of snow, pristine and white and deadly beautiful. Jake stood, his muscles aching from the cold and the awkward sleeping position. He joined Siki at the window, careful to maintain a proper distance. "The storm has passed," he said, more to himself than to her. "We can make it to my ranch today. It is not far." She looked at him, and though she clearly did not understand his words, she seemed to grasp his meaning. She nodded slowly, then gestured to her clothes, which Jake had laid near the fire to dry. They were still damp in places, but they were the only clothes she had. She pointed to the door, indicating he should turn around or leave while she dressed. Jake quickly stepped outside, giving her privacy. The cold hit him immediately, but it was nothing compared to the previous day's fury. His horse nickered at him, and he patted its neck reassuringly. The animal had weathered the night well enough, though it would need food and proper shelter soon. When Siki emerged from the shack, dressed in her dried deerskin clothing, Jake helped her onto the horse and climbed up behind her. The ride to his ranch took several hours, the deep snow making progress slow, but eventually they crested a hill and looked down on the Morrison spread. It was not the largest ranch in Texas, but it was respectable, with a sturdy house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant his housekeeper, Mrs. Margaret Carson, had kept the home fires burning despite his absence. As they approached, Mrs. Carson emerged from the house, her round face creased with worry that transformed into relief when she saw Jake. "Mr. Morrison, thank the Lord. We were so worried when you did not return before the storm." Her eyes widened when she noticed Siki. "And who is this?" "This is Siki," Jake said, helping the girl down from the horse. "I found her in the storm. She would have died if I had not come across her. She is Apache, does not speak English. I thought perhaps we could help her, at least until we figure out where she belongs." Mrs. Carson's expression softened immediately. She was a widow who had worked for Jake's family since he was a boy, and she had a kind heart beneath her practical exterior. "Of course, the poor dear. Come inside, child. Let us get you properly warm and fed." Siki looked to Jake uncertainly, and he nodded encouragingly. "It is all right. Mrs. Carson will take good care of you." Over the following days, Siki gradually settled into the ranch house. Mrs. Carson fussed over her, making sure she ate well and had warm clothes to wear. Jake had no women's clothing in the house, so Mrs. Carson took some of her own dresses and altered them to fit Siki's smaller frame. The girl seemed bewildered by the layers and buttons and stays, so different from her traditional clothing, but she adapted with grace. Communication was a challenge at first. Jake would point to objects and say their English names, and Siki would repeat them, her pronunciation improving with each attempt. She was remarkably intelligent, picking up words and phrases with surprising speed. Within a week, she could express basic needs and understand simple instructions. Jake learned more about her situation through these halting conversations. She had been with a small group of Apache who were trying to reach relatives in Mexico, but they had been scattered by the storm. She had become separated, lost in the blinding snow, and had accepted that she would die. She spoke of her family with sadness in her eyes, and Jake understood that they were gone, taken by violence or disease, the common fate of so many of her people in these troubled times. As winter slowly loosened its grip on the Texas plains, Siki became part of the household. She insisted on helping with chores, and Mrs. Carson taught her to cook American food, though Siki sometimes prepared dishes from her own culture, using ingredients she found around the ranch. Jake was surprised by how much he enjoyed these meals, the unfamiliar spices and preparations a welcome change from the usual fare. Spring arrived with its usual flourish of wildflowers and new calves. The ranch kept Jake busy from dawn until dusk, mending fences, branding cattle, breaking horses. Siki often watched from the porch, and one day she surprised him by approaching the corral where he was working with a particularly stubborn mare. "I can help," she said, her English still accented but increasingly confident. Jake paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "This mare is wild, Siki. She could hurt you." "My people, we know horses," Siki replied. "I can help." Jake was skeptical but curious. He opened the corral gate and let her in, ready to intervene if the horse showed aggression. But Siki approached the mare differently than Jake had, moving slowly, humming a low tune. She did not try to dominate the animal but seemed to invite connection. To Jake's amazement, the mare calmed within minutes, allowing Siki to touch her neck, then her face. "You have a gift," Jake said, genuine admiration in his voice. Siki smiled, a real smile that transformed her usually serious face. "My father taught me. He was good with horses." From that day forward, Siki helped with the horses whenever she could. The ranch hands, initially suspicious of having an Apache on the property, gradually came to respect her skill. She had a way with the difficult animals, the ones that bucked and fought against training, and under her gentle guidance, they became manageable. As spring turned to summer, Jake found himself increasingly aware of Siki's presence. She was no longer just the girl he had rescued from the snow. She had become a vital part of the ranch, someone he looked forward to seeing each morning. He noticed little things about her, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the sound of her laugh when Mrs. Carson told stories, the graceful way she moved. But Jake was careful with his feelings. Siki had been through so much, lost so much. The last thing she needed was him complicating her life. Besides, there was the matter of society's judgment. Texas in 1878 was not kind to unconventional relationships, especially those that crossed cultural boundaries. Jake had already heard whispers in town when he brought supplies, questions about the Indian girl living on his ranch. One evening in late July, after a long day of work, Jake was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Siki joined him. She had become more comfortable around him over the months, no longer viewing him with wariness. "The sky is beautiful," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "It is," Jake agreed. "I never get tired of watching it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Siki spoke again. "Jake, why did you help me? That day in the storm," he considered the question carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do. You were a person in need and I could help. It was that simple." "Not simple," Siki said softly. "Many white men would not help Apache girl. Some would hurt her." Jake felt a heaviness in his chest at her words because he knew they were true. "I am not those men," he said finally. "My father taught me that every life has value, regardless of where someone comes from or what they look like. I have tried to live by that." Siki turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Your father was wise man." "He was," Jake said, feeling the familiar ache of loss. His parents had died of fever 5 years earlier, leaving him the ranch and a legacy of decency he tried his best to honor. As summer progressed, Jake realized that what he felt for Siki had grown beyond respect and friendship. He was falling in love with her, perhaps had been falling for months without fully acknowledging it. But he kept these feelings locked away, uncertain whether she could ever return them, uncertain whether it was fair to even hope for such a thing. The first test of their relationship came in August, when Jake needed to take cattle to market in San Angelo. It was a trip that would require him to be away for several days. Mrs. Carson assured him that she and Siki would be fine, but Jake felt uneasy about leaving them. "We will manage perfectly well," Mrs. Carson said, shooing him toward his packed horse. "Siki is quite capable and the hands will be nearby if we need anything." Siki stood on the porch and Jake thought he saw concern in her eyes. "You will come back?" she asked. The question surprised him. "Of course I will come back. This is my home. You are here." The words hung in the air between them, heavier with meaning than Jake had intended. Siki's expression softened and she nodded. "Be safe, Jake Morrison." The cattle drive was uneventful and Jake completed his business in San Angelo quickly. But while in town, he encountered trouble. He was leaving the bank when he overheard men talking outside the saloon. "Morrison's got himself a squaw living at his place," one man said, his voice thick with drink and disdain. "Heard she does tricks with horses, probably casting Indian spells on them." "Someone ought to remind him that keeping company with savages ain't proper," another added. "This is a civilized town now. We do not need their kind around." Jake felt anger rise in his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. Starting a fight would only make matters worse. Instead, he approached the men directly. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice hard as iron. "I could not help but overhear your conversation. Let me make something clear. Miss Siki is a guest on my ranch, and she has proven herself to be hardworking, intelligent, and kind. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly instead of gossiping like old women." The men looked startled, then angry. One of them, A large man with a scarred face named Dutch Henderson stepped forward. "You defend them Indians after what they have done." "After the raids and the killings." "I defend innocent people," Jake replied evenly. "Siki has done nothing wrong. She is no more responsible for the actions of hostile Apache than you are responsible for every crime committed by a white man." Dutch looked ready to argue further, but the town sheriff, Tom Bradley, appeared from around the corner. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem, Sheriff," Jake said, keeping his eyes on Dutch. "I was just leaving." As he rode back toward the ranch, Jake felt troubled. He had known that keeping Siki at the ranch would cause talk, but he had underestimated how hostile some people would be. He would need to be careful to protect her from the ugliness that prejudice could bring. When he arrived home, Siki ran out to meet him, and the joy on her face at seeing him return safely made his heart clench. Mrs. Carson stood in the doorway, smiling knowingly, and Jake realized that his feelings for Siki were probably obvious to everyone but Siki herself. Autumn arrived with cooler temperatures and the hard work of preparing for winter. Jake and his hands rounded up cattle, repaired buildings, and laid in supplies. Siki continued to help, her presence now so natural on the ranch that Jake could barely remember what life had been like before he found her in the snow. One October evening, Jake asked Siki to walk with him after dinner. They strolled toward the creek that ran through his property, the water running low as it always did in fall. The cottonwood trees along the bank were turning gold, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. "Siki," Jake began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. "It has been almost a year since I found you in the storm." "Yes," she said softly, "a year since you saved my life. You have become very important to me," Jake continued, his heart pounding. "These past months, getting to know you, working alongside you, I have realized something. I have feelings for you, deep feelings." Siki stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "What kind of feelings?" "The kind of feelings a man has for a woman he wants to marry," Jake said, the words rushing out now. "I know this might seem sudden, and I know there are complications. People in town already talk, but I do not care what they think. I care about you. I care about your happiness. And if there is any chance you might feel the same way, I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the creek and the distant lowing of cattle. Jake's mouth went dry as he waited for her response, fearing he had moved too quickly, that he had misread the warmth he sometimes saw in her eyes. Finally, Siki spoke. "When I was in the snow, dying, I made peace with death. I had lost everything, my family, my home, my people's way of life. I thought there was nothing left for me in this world. But then you came. You saved me not just from the cold, but from the emptiness inside. You gave me purpose again, a place where I belong." She stepped closer to him, and Jake could see tears shining in her eyes. "I have feelings for you too, Jake Morrison. I think I have had them for a long time, but I was afraid that you could not truly care for Apache girl. Afraid that I would lose this happiness if I reached for more. But yes, I want to be your wife if you truly want me." Joy flooded through Jake, and he reached out to take her hands in his. "I truly want you, Siki, more than anything." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and kissed her gently. Her lips were soft and warm, and when she kissed him back, Jake felt as though his heart might burst from his chest. When they returned to the house hand in hand, Mrs. Carson took one look at them and burst into happy tears. "Oh, I knew it. I told myself months ago that you two were perfect for each other. This calls for celebration." But celebration would have to wait. Jake knew that marrying Siki would not be simple. They needed to find a preacher willing to perform the ceremony. And Jake wanted to do this properly. to give Siki the wedding she deserved despite the obstacles they would face. The next day, Jake rode into San Angelo to speak with Reverend Paul Wright, the pastor of the town's Methodist church. Reverend Wright was a thoughtful man who had always treated Jake fairly, and Jake hoped he would understand. The Reverend listened carefully as Jake explained the situation. When Jake finished, Reverend Wright was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. "You understand this will not be easy," the Reverend said finally. "There are people in this town who will object strongly to such a union. They will make life difficult for you both." "I understand," Jake said, "but I love her, Reverend. She is good and kind, and she has become a Christian. Mrs. Carson has been teaching her from the Bible, and Siki has embraced the faith. Is that not what matters most?" Reverend Wright smiled slightly. "You are right, of course. If she has accepted Christ, then she is our sister in faith, regardless of her heritage. Very well, Mr. Morrison. I will marry you, but I think it would be wise to have the ceremony at your ranch rather than in the church. It will spare you both some unpleasantness." Jake agreed, though it saddened him that Siki could not have a proper church wedding. Still, he was grateful that Reverend Wright was willing to perform the ceremony at all. The wedding was set for a Saturday in late November, just before the anniversary of the day Jake had found Siki. Mrs. Carson threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, baking cakes and pies, cleaning the house until it shone, and helping Siki sew a simple but lovely white dress. Siki had indeed been studying Christianity with Mrs. Carson, finding comfort in the teachings even as she held onto aspects of her Apache spirituality. Jake admired her ability to bridge two worlds, to hold onto who she was while embracing something new. The wedding day arrived clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue overhead. Jake invited only a few people, his closest ranch hands and a couple of neighbors he trusted. It was a small gathering, but that made it feel more intimate, more meaningful. When Siki emerged from the house in her white dress, her long dark hair flowing loose down her back, Jake felt his breath catch. She was beautiful, radiant, and the smile she gave him was full of joy and hope. Reverend Wright conducted a simple but moving ceremony on the porch of the ranch house, speaking about love and commitment, about two people from different worlds choosing to build a life together. When he pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed his new bride, the small group of witnesses applauded warmly. The celebration that followed was joyful despite its modest scale. Mrs. Carson had outdone herself with the food, and one of the ranch hands played fiddle while others danced. Siki laughed as Jake spun her around, and for those few hours, the rest of the world and its prejudices faded away. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Jake held Siki gently, still hardly believing that she was his wife. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "I am happy. I have found home again, Jake. Home is wherever you are." They made love tenderly, learning each other's bodies, whispering words of affection and desire. Afterward, as Siki slept curled against him, Jake lay awake feeling profound gratitude. He had been given an extraordinary gift, and he vowed to spend every day proving himself worthy of it. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with several storms that buried the ranch in snow. But the house was warm, and Jake had never been more content. He and Siki worked together during the day and shared quiet evenings by the fire. She told him stories of her childhood, of her people's customs and beliefs, and he found her culture fascinating, so different from his own yet beautiful in its connection to the land and nature. Siki also proved to be an excellent partner in running the ranch. She had a head for numbers and began helping Jake with the books, catching errors and suggesting ways to economize. The ranch hands, who had initially been skeptical, now treated her with genuine respect, coming to her for advice about difficult horses or even personal problems. But life was not without challenges. When Jake and Siki went to town together, they faced stares and whispered comments. Some shopkeepers were kind, but others were pointedly rude. There was one particularly ugly incident at the general store when a woman loudly declared that it was a disgrace to see a white man married to a savage. Jake had started to respond, but Siki touched his arm gently. "Let it go," she said quietly. "Her hate hurts her more than it hurts us." Jake was amazed by her grace, her ability to rise above the ignorance directed at her. But he also saw the toll it took, the way her shoulders would slump after such encounters, the sadness that would cloud her eyes. "Maybe we should not go to town so often," he suggested one evening after a particularly difficult visit. Siki shook her head firmly. "No, if we hide, they win. We have done nothing wrong. We love each other. That is beautiful, not shameful. We must live our lives with pride." Her strength humbled him, and Jake fell more deeply in love with her each day. Spring came again, and with it, wonderful news. Siki was pregnant. She told Jake one morning in May, her face glowing with happiness and nervousness. "Are you pleased?" she asked. "I know we did not plan this so soon." "Pleased?" Jake laughed and picked her up, spinning her around gently before remembering her condition and setting her down carefully. "Siki, I am overjoyed. A baby, our baby. This is the best news I could imagine. Mrs. Carson was equally thrilled and immediately became protective of Siki, insisting she rest more and not work too hard. Siki tolerated this fussing with good humor, though she continued helping with ranch duties within reason. As her belly grew round with their child, Jake found himself constantly worried about her, checking on her throughout the day, making sure she was comfortable. Siki would laugh at his concern but also seemed touched by it. The baby was due in late December, and as autumn progressed, Jake began preparing. He made sure the house was well stocked with supplies in case a storm prevented them from reaching town. He arranged for the local midwife, a capable woman named Hannah Cooper, to stay at the ranch as Siki's time approached. In early December, when the first real snow of the season fell, Siki went into labor. It was evening, and Jake had just come in from checking on the livestock when she gripped his arm, her face tense. "It is time," she said. The next hours were the longest of Jake's life. Mrs. Carson and Hannah Cooper tended to Siki while Jake paced outside the bedroom door, listening to her cries of pain and feeling helpless. He wanted to be with her, to comfort her, but the women had shooed him out, saying he would only be in the way. Finally, as midnight approached, he heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's lusty cry. Moments later, Mrs. Carson opened the door, tears streaming down her face. "You have a son, Mr. Morrison, a healthy, strong son, and Siki is fine. Tired, but fine." Jake rushed into the room. Siki lay propped against pillows, her face pale and exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Jake approached slowly, awed by the sight. "Meet your son," Siki said softly, adjusting the blanket so Jake could see the baby's face. The infant had a dusting of dark hair and was scrunching up his face, making little noises of displeasure at being out in the cold world. Jake reached out and gently touched one tiny hand, and the baby's fingers immediately closed around his index finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing. I love you so much." "I love you too," Siki replied. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for weeks but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Jake thought of his own father, John Morrison, a good man who had taught him about integrity and kindness. "What about John?" he suggested. John Samuel Morrison, after my father and my grandfather. Siki smiled. John. Yes, that is good name, strong name. But he should also have Apache name. In my language, his name will be Nahilze. It means he is strong. John Nahilze Morrison, Jake said, testing how it sounded. I like it. Our son will carry both our worlds with him. Those first weeks with the baby were exhausting but wonderful. John was a healthy infant with a powerful set of lungs, and he kept the entire household awake with his nighttime demands. But Jake did not mind. He would sit by the fire in the early morning hours, holding his son while Siki slept, marveling at the tiny life they had created. As John grew from an infant into a chubby, curious baby, the ranch thrived. Jake had a particularly good year with the cattle, and he was able to make improvements to the property, building a larger barn and expanding the house to include a proper nursery. When John was about 6 months old, Jake and Siki took him to town for the first time. It was a risk, Jake knew, but they needed supplies, and Siki insisted that they could not hide their family away forever. The reactions were mixed. Some people cooed over the baby, as people always do, commenting on his bright eyes and happy disposition. But others stared coldly or turned away. Jake noticed Dutch Henderson glaring at them from across the street, and he instinctively moved closer to Siki. They were loading supplies into their wagon when Reverend Wright approached. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, what a pleasure to see you, and this must be young John. May I? Siki hesitated, then handed the baby to the Reverend. Reverend Wright held John with the ease of someone who had blessed many infants, smiling down at the child. He is a fine boy, the Reverend said warmly. You must be very proud. Would you like me to baptize him? I would be honored to do so. The offer clearly touched Siki. You would do that? Even though people will judge you. Reverend Wright's expression became serious. Mrs. Morrison, I serve God, not the prejudices of men. Your son deserves to be welcomed into the Christian community just like any other child. Shall we say Sunday next? The baptism took place not in the church, but at the ranch again, to spare the Reverend any serious backlash from his congregation. But it was a meaningful ceremony nonetheless, with John crying lustily as the holy water was sprinkled on his forehead, and then settling peacefully as Reverend Wright spoke blessings over him. As the months passed into the second year of their marriage, Jake and Siki's relationship deepened. They had weathered the initial challenges, the prejudice and the obstacles, and had emerged stronger. They knew each other intimately now, not just physically but emotionally. They knew each other's fears and hopes, their habits and preferences. Siki had nightmares sometimes, dreams of the day she was separated from her people, of the cold snow pulling her down. Jake would hold her when she woke gasping and shaking, whispering reassurances until she calmed. And when Jake had his own dark moments, memories of his parents' deaths or worries about keeping the ranch profitable, Siki was there with quiet strength, reminding him that they would face whatever came together. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching John toddle around the yard under Mrs. Carson's watchful eye, Siki turned to Jake with a thoughtful expression. You ever regret it? She asked. Marrying me, making our life harder than it had to be. Jake took her hand firmly. Never, not once, not for a single moment. Yes, life would be easier if people were less narrow-minded, but I would not trade what we have for anything. You and John are everything to me. Good, Siki said, a smile playing at her lips, because I have news. We are going to have another baby. Joy surged through Jake again, as fresh and powerful as it had been with the first announcement. Truly, oh Siki, that is wonderful. Their second child, a daughter, was born the following spring. The birth was easier than John's had been, and when Jake held his daughter for the first time, Looking into her tiny face, he felt his heart expand even further. "She needs a name that honors both our peoples," Siki said from the bed. "I was thinking Sarah. It was the name of woman who was kind to me when I first came to town. She worked at the dress shop, and when others were cruel, she smiled and treated me with respect." "Sarah," Jake said thoughtfully. "I like it. Sarah Grace Morrison. Grace because she is a blessing." "And her Apache name will be Desba," Siki added. "It means she goes to war. She will need to be strong in this world." "Sarah Desba Morrison," Jake said. "Our fierce little girl." With 2 children now, the house was constantly full of noise and activity. John was nearly 2 and into everything, his curiosity endless and exhausting. Baby Sarah was calmer but had her own strong will, especially when it came to feeding time. Mrs. Carson had her hands full helping Siki manage the children, and Jake hired a young woman from town, Emma Davis, to help with some of the household work. Emma was a quiet girl from a poor family who needed the work and was grateful for the employment. She was one of the few people in San Angelo who treated Siki with consistent kindness. As the children grew, Jake and Siki worked to teach them about both sides of their heritage. They attended church services when Reverend Wright held private gatherings for families who did not fit into polite society's narrow definitions. But Siki also taught the children Apache stories and songs, told them about their ancestors and the old ways. "They should know where they come from," she explained to Jake. "All of where they come from. They are both white and Apache. To deny either part would be to deny who they truly are." Jake agreed completely. He wanted his children to be proud of their mixed heritage, to see it as a strength rather than something to hide. When John was 4 and Sarah was 2, trouble came to the ranch in the form of cattle rustlers. Jake woke one night to the sound of gunshots and shouts. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, telling Siki to stay with the children and lock the door. In the darkness, he could see figures on horseback driving some of his cattle toward the northern fence line. His ranch hands were already responding, and Jake joined them, firing warning shots. The thieves returned fire, and for several terrifying minutes bullets flew through the night. One of the rustlers fell from his horse, and the others quickly abandoned their attempt, riding off into the darkness. When the dust settled, Jake and his men gathered around the fallen thief. It was Dutch Henderson, wounded in the leg but alive. "Get him inside," Jake ordered. "Send someone for the sheriff." Dutch was cursing and struggling, but the men hauled him into the barn and bound his wound to stop the bleeding. By the time Sheriff Bradley arrived at dawn, the full picture had become clear. Dutch and his associates had been running a rustling operation for months, hitting various ranches in the area. "You did the county a service tonight," Sheriff Bradley said as his deputies took Dutch into custody. "We have been trying to catch these men for a long time." After the excitement died down and the sheriff left, Jake returned to the house exhausted. Siki met him at the door, her face pale with worry. "Are you hurt?" she asked, running her hands over him as if checking for injuries. "I am fine," he assured her. "It is over. No one was seriously hurt except the thieves." She pulled him into a fierce embrace. "I was so afraid. When I heard the shots, I thought I might lose you. I do not want our children to grow up without their father." "You are not going to lose me," Jake promised, though he knew that in the dangerous world of the frontier, there were no guarantees. "I will always fight to come back to you." Life settled into a routine again after the rustling incident. The ranch continued to prosper, and Jake was able to expand his herd. John started helping with small chores around the ranch, eager to be like his father, and Sarah followed her big brother everywhere, determined to do whatever he did. On a warm afternoon in June, when they had been married for nearly 4 years, Jake came in from the fields to find Siki teaching the children a traditional Apache song. They were sitting in the shade of the cottonwood tree, and Siki's voice rose and fell in the melodic patterns of her native language. Jake stood watching for a moment, struck by the beauty of the scene. His wife and children, the life they had built together despite all the obstacles. It was not always easy, and they still faced prejudice and challenges, but it was real and it was theirs. That evening, after the children were asleep, Jake and Siki sat on their porch as they often did, enjoying the cool night air. "You remember the day I found you?" Jake asked. Siki nodded. "Of course, how could I forget? It was the day my life changed forever." "Mine too," Jake said. "When I saw you in that snow, I never imagined that we would end up here, married with 2 beautiful children. I just wanted to save a life." "You saved more than my life," Siki said softly. "You saved my spirit. You gave me hope when I had none. You loved me when the world said you should not. That is worth more than I can ever say." Jake pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You have given me just as much. You have taught me about strength and grace, about holding on to who you are even when others want you to change. Our children are lucky to have you as their mother." "And you as their father," Siki replied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, a coyote howled, and from the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. Everything was peaceful, safe, home. As the years continued to pass, the Morrison family grew and changed. John developed into a serious, thoughtful boy with his father's sense of responsibility and his mother's connection to horses and nature. Sarah was more spirited, quick to laugh and quick to argue, never backing down from anything. When John was 7 and Sarah was 5, Siki became pregnant again. This third pregnancy was more difficult than the previous ones, and Jake worried constantly. But in the early winter, Siki gave birth to another son, whom they named James Tahoma Morrison. James was tiny and fragile at first, and there were frightening days when they wondered if he would survive. But he proved tougher than he looked, growing stronger with each passing week. With 3 children now, Jake began thinking about their future in new ways. He wanted them to have opportunities, to get educations and make their own choices about their lives. But he also knew that their mixed heritage would make some paths more difficult. San Angelo was growing and changing too. The railroad had reached the town, bringing new people and new attitudes. Some of these newcomers were more accepting than the old guard had been, and Jake began to feel that perhaps the world was slowly, grudgingly becoming a place where his children might have easier lives than he and Siki had experienced. When John turned 8, Jake and Siki decided to send him to the new school that had opened in San Angelo. It was a difficult decision, knowing that John would face questions and possibly cruelty from other children, but they wanted him to learn to read and write properly, to have the tools he would need to succeed. The first weeks were hard. John came home several times with bruises from fights and once with a black eye. But he never complained, never asked to stop going. And gradually, as the other children got to know him, saw that he was smart and kind and honest, some of them became his friends. Sarah started school 2 years later and faced her own challenges, but her fierce nature served her well. She would not tolerate anyone speaking badly about her mother or her heritage, and she earned a reputation as someone not to cross. Yet she was also popular, her bright personality winning people over. Young James, as he grew from a baby into a toddler, proved to be the most easygoing of the 3 children. He was content to play quietly for hours, building elaborate structures with blocks or following the ranch cats around the barn. One autumn evening, when the children were all in bed and Jake and Siki had a rare moment alone. They reflected on how far they had come. 4 winters, Siki said thoughtfully. That is what I told the children today when Sarah asked how long you and I had known each other before we married. 4 winters had passed from the day you found me to the day we wed. Jake did the math in his head. That is right. I found you in January of 78 and we married in November of 79. Almost 2 years. It felt both longer and shorter, Siki mused. So much happened in that time. I learned a new language, a new way of living. I fell in love. I became a wife. And now here we are, all these years later, Jake said. Still in love with 3 wonderful children and a good life. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe it is real. It is real, Siki assured him, taking his hand. We made it real through our choices, our commitment to each other. No one gave this to us. We built it together. They were interrupted by the sound of crying from inside. James had woken from a nightmare. Siki rose to tend to him, but Jake stopped her. Let me, he said. You have been with them all day. Rest. He went inside and found James sitting up in his small bed, tears streaming down his face. Jake scooped him up and held him close, feeling the little boy's rapid heartbeat gradually slow. What scared you? Jake asked gently. Monster, James whispered. Big monster wanted to eat me. There are no monsters here, Jake promised. I will not let anything hurt you. You are safe. He carried James to the rocking chair by the window and sat down, rocking slowly. He sang a lullaby that his own mother had sung to him, and gradually James relaxed, his breathing becoming slow and even. But Jake continued rocking, looking out the window at the ranch he had built, thinking about the family he had been blessed with. His father had once told him that a good life was not measured by wealth or status, but by love and purpose. By that measure, Jake knew he was the richest man in Texas. He had a wife he adored, children who filled his days with joy and meaning, and honest work that sustained them all. When James was deeply asleep, Jake carried him back to bed and tucked him in carefully. He looked in on John and Sarah as well, seeing them peaceful in their beds, and felt a wave of protectiveness so strong it was almost painful. The next morning brought a surprise. A small group of Apache rode onto the ranch property, and Jake initially tensed, his hand moving toward his rifle. But Siki, who had been hanging laundry, suddenly cried out in joy and ran toward them. Jake watched as she embraced an older woman who had dismounted, both of them crying and speaking rapid Apache. He approached cautiously, and Siki turned to him, her face radiant. Jake, this is my aunt, my mother's sister. I thought all my family was gone, but she survived. She has been searching for me for years. The reunion was emotional and beautiful. Siki's aunt, whose name was Gallion, had indeed survived the troubles that had scattered their people. She had heard rumors of an Apache woman married to a white rancher near San Angelo, and had traveled to investigate, hardly daring to hope it might be her lost niece. Through Siki translating, Jake welcomed Gallion and her companions to stay as long as they wished. They set up camp near the creek, and for the next week, Siki spent every possible moment with her aunt, hungry for connection to her past, for stories about her parents and her childhood. Jake watched his wife bloom in her aunt's presence, saw her speak her native language freely for the first time in years. The children were fascinated by these new relatives, and Gallion doted on them, teaching them Apache words and games. When it came time for Gallion to leave, Siki was teary but also peaceful. I know now that I am not the last, she told Jake. There are others my people survive. That gives me strength. You will see her again, Jake promised. She knows where to find us now. This will always be a welcoming place for her. True to his word, Gallion returned the following year and then became a regular visitor, usually staying for a few weeks at a time. Her presence enriched the children's understanding of their heritage, and Jake was grateful for it. As the calendar turned to 1886, Jake realized with some surprise that he and Siki had been married for over 6 years. Their oldest, John, was now 9 and already showing signs of the man he would become, responsible and thoughtful. Sarah was 7, still fierce but developing a tender side she tried to hide. And James, at 3, was talking constantly, asking endless questions about everything he saw. The ranch was more prosperous than ever. Jake had established a reputation for raising quality horses, thanks in large part to Siki's training methods, and buyers came from across Texas to purchase from the Morrison spread. They had been able to save money, and Jake was thinking about the future, about ensuring his children would have inheritance and opportunities. One evening in spring, as they prepared for bed, Siki stood by the window looking out at the land bathed in moonlight. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked, coming to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "About how strange life is," she replied. "If that storm had not come, if you had ridden a different path that day, if you had decided I was not worth the trouble of saving, everything would be different. I would be dead and you would be alone and our children would never have existed. But those things did not happen," Jake said. "You survived, I found you. We built this life together." "I know," Siki said. "I am grateful for every moment, even the difficult ones. They brought us here, to this place, to this happiness." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face. Jake covered her hand with his own, marveling at how much he still loved her, how the sight of her still made his heart race after all these years. "I want you to know something," Siki said seriously. "These years with you, this life we have made, it is more than I ever dreamed possible when I was a girl. You have given me a home, a family, respect, love. You looked at me and saw a person worth saving, worth loving, when so many others would have only seen an Indian to ignore or worse. I will love you until my last breath, Jake Morrison." "And I will love you until mine," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You are my heart, Siki. You and our children are everything that matters." They kissed then, tender and passionate, a reaffirmation of the bond they had forged through adversity and strengthened through commitment. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Jake thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had been a simple cowboy, lonely but content with his life, when a blizzard and chance had put a dying girl in his path. Saving her had seemed like the obvious choice, the only choice, really. He could never have imagined that the girl in the snow would become his beloved wife, the mother of his children, his partner in every sense of the word. The years continued to unfold, bringing both joys and sorrows. Mrs. Carson passed away peacefully in her sleep when John was 11, and the whole family mourned her. She had been instrumental in helping Siki adapt to her new life, and her absence left a hole in their household. But they honored her memory by living the values she had championed: kindness, hard work, and acceptance. Emma Davis, who had worked for them for years, took over more of the household management. She had become like family, and when she married one of Jake's ranch hands, a good man named Robert Miller, Jake and Siki held the wedding at the ranch and helped the young couple build a small house on the property. The children continued to grow and develop their own personalities and dreams. John showed an aptitude for numbers and business, and Jake began teaching him about managing the ranch's finances. Sarah discovered a love of books and would read anything she could get her hands on, often by lamplight late into the night. James developed his mother's gift with horses and could often be found in the barn, talking softly to the animals. When John turned 16, he asked his parents a serious question. "What am I?" he said one evening at dinner. "The kids at school, some of them say I am white, others say I am Indian. I do not feel fully either. What do I tell them?" Siki and Jake exchanged glances, and then Siki spoke. "You are both, and you are neither. You are John Morrison, and that is enough. You do not have to choose one heritage over the other to please other people. You are our son, and you come from two proud peoples. That makes you strong, not confused." "Your mother is right," Jake added. "The world wants to put people in simple categories, but people are more complex than that. You are who you choose to be, son. Let your character define you, not what others think about your blood." John seemed satisfied with this answer, and as he grew into a young man, he carried himself with quiet confidence that commanded respect. Life was not without its continued challenges. There were droughts that tested the ranch's resources, illnesses that swept through the livestock, and always the undercurrent of prejudice that never fully went away. But Jake and Siki faced everything together, their partnership unshakable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake took Siki back to the place where he had found her. It was a mild November day, the landscape peaceful under a bright blue sky. They stood together, looking at the spot where her life had nearly ended and their story had begun. 10 years, Siki said wonderingly. 10 years since you made me your wife. Best decision I ever made, Jake said firmly. I was so nervous that day, Siki admitted. I kept thinking, what if he regrets this? What if he wakes up one day and wishes he had married a white woman who would have made his life easier? Jake pulled her close. Never, not once have I regretted it. Has life been easy? No, but it has been good, Siki. It has been real and meaningful and full of love. I would not trade one moment of our life together for an easier path with someone else. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, remembering the journey that had brought them from that desperate rescue in the snow to this moment of peace and gratitude. As they rode back to the ranch, Siki said, "We should tell our children the whole story someday, not just the simple version, but all of it. The fear I felt, the prejudice we faced, the choice we made to love each other anyway. They should know what we overcame." "You are right," Jake agreed. "They should know. When they are old enough to understand, we will tell them everything." That evening, the whole family gathered for a special anniversary dinner. The children, now 14, 12, and 9, had made decorations and helped Emma prepare a feast. After the meal, John stood and raised his glass of cider. "To Ma and Pa," he said, "thank you for showing us what love and commitment look like. Thank you for being brave enough to build this family even when the world made it hard. We are proud to be your children." Sarah and James echoed the toast, and Jake saw tears in Siki's eyes. They were good kids, all three of them, growing into fine young people despite the obstacles they faced because of their mixed heritage. As more years passed, the Morrison children began to forge their own paths. John went to work full-time on the ranch, learning every aspect of the operation from his father. He was a natural leader, and the ranch hands respected him. Sarah won a scholarship to a teaching college in Austin, the first person in the family to pursue higher education. And James, still young but showing great promise, continued to work with the horses. When Sarah left for college at 18, it was an emotional day. Siki helped her daughter pack, giving her advice about navigating a world that might judge her for her heritage. "Hold your head high," Siki told her. "You are as good as anyone there. You are smart and capable and worthy of every opportunity. Do not let anyone make you feel less than that." Sarah hugged her mother tightly. "I will make you proud, Ma, I promise." "You already do," Siki assured her. After Sarah's wagon pulled away toward Austin, Siki allowed herself to cry. Jake held her on the porch as she wept, understanding that these were tears of both pride and loss. Their little girl was growing up, venturing into a world that might not always be kind to her. But Sarah thrived at college, her natural intelligence and determination earning her respect from both teachers and fellow students. She wrote home regularly, her letters full of excitement about what she was learning. She did face some prejudice, but she handled it with the grace and strength her parents had modeled. Meanwhile, John met a young woman named Elizabeth Turner at a cattle auction in Fort Worth. Elizabeth came from a ranching family and shared John's love of the land and livestock. She was also one of the rare people who never seemed to notice or care about John's mixed heritage. She loved him for who he was, and when John brought her home to meet his parents, Siki and Jake immediately welcomed her. John and Elizabeth married when he was 22, and the wedding was a joyous celebration at the ranch. Seeing his son happy and settled brought Jake immense satisfaction. The Morrison family legacy would continue. A year later, John and Elizabeth had their first child, a daughter they named Margaret in honor of Mrs. Carson. When Jake held his granddaughter for the first time, he felt a profound sense of continuity. This tiny girl carried his blood, Siki's blood, and the heritage of two peoples flowing forward into the future. Siki was a devoted grandmother, doting on Margaret but also maintaining the firm boundaries she had used with her own children. She taught Margaret the same Apache songs and stories she had taught her children, ensuring that the heritage continued down through the generations. Sarah returned home after completing her teaching degree and secured a position at the school in San Angelo. It was the same school she had attended as a child, and now she was shaping young minds herself. She handled the occasional parent who objected to having a half-Apache teacher with professionalism and dignity. At 23, Sarah met a young lawyer named Daniel Foster who had recently moved to San Angelo from back east. Daniel was educated and progressive in his thinking, and he was not deterred by Sarah's heritage. If anything, he admired her strength and the obstacles she had overcome. They courted for a year before Daniel asked Jake for Sarah's hand in marriage. "I love your daughter, sir," Daniel said earnestly. "I know that her life has not always been easy, that people have judged her unfairly because of her mixed heritage. I want to build a life with her where she is respected and valued as she deserves." Jake appreciated the young man's sincerity. "Sarah can make her own decision about who she marries, but if you are asking for my blessing, you have it. Treat her well and we will have no problems." Sarah and Daniel married in a lovely ceremony at the ranch, with Reverend Wright once again officiating. The Reverend was quite elderly now but still sharp, and he spoke movingly about love transcending boundaries and two people choosing to build a life together. James, now 16, was becoming an exceptional horseman. Word of his ability spread, and people began bringing their most difficult horses to the Morrison ranch specifically for him to train. He had inherited his mother's gift and his father's patience, a powerful combination. As Jake entered his 50s and Siki her mid-40s, they found themselves in a new phase of life. Their children were grown and starting families of their own. The ranch ran smoothly under John's capable management. They had more time for each other, for quiet moments and reflection. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, a familiar ritual they had performed countless times over the years, Siki said, "We did good, did we not? With our children, with our life." "We did very good," Jake agreed. "Against all odds, we built something beautiful." "I think about that girl in the snow sometimes," Siki mused. "The one you found all those years ago. She was so lost, so ready to die. If she could see me now, see this life, I think she would not believe it." "But you did it," Jake said. "You survived and thrived and built a life that matters. You should be proud." "We did it together," Siki corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you. You were my anchor when I was adrift, my strength when I was weak, my home when I was lost." Jake took her hand, weathered now with age and work, but still the hand he loved to hold. "And you were my heart when I did not know I needed one. You taught me about real love, about commitment that goes beyond the easy days. You made me a better man." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first uncertain conversations in that lined shack so many years ago. More grandchildren arrived over the following years. Sarah and Daniel had twins, a boy and a girl they named Marcus and Melody. John and Elizabeth had 2 more children after Margaret. James eventually married a woman named Catherine who shared his love of horses, and they began their own family. As Jake moved into his 60s, he gradually turned over more of the ranch's day-to-day operations to John, though he still enjoyed working with the cattle and horses when his body allowed. Siki remained active and strong. Her dark hair now shot through with silver, but her spirit as fierce as ever. They made a tradition of returning each year to the spot where Jake had found Siki. It became their own private anniversary celebration, a pilgrimage to honor where their story had begun. They would stand together in that place, remembering that desperate day when a freezing girl and a determined cowboy's paths had crossed, changing both their lives forever. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. All 3 of their children were there with their spouses and children. The house was full of laughter and noise, children running everywhere, adults catching up on news and sharing stories. That evening, after most of the guests had left and the grandchildren were sleeping, the immediate family gathered around the fireplace. Sarah, always the organizer, had arranged for everyone to share favorite memories. "I remember," John began, "when I was young, maybe 5 or 6, and some kids at school said mean things about Ma. I came home crying, and Pa sat me down and told me that the measure of a person is not what others say about them, but how they live their lives. He said that Ma was the strongest, bravest, kindest person he knew, and that I should be proud to be her son. I never forgot that." Sarah spoke next. "I remember Ma teaching me to braid my hair in the Apache way. She told me stories about her mother and her grandmother, about strong women who survived terrible things. She said that strength was in our blood, and that we could face anything as long as we remembered where we came from." James added, "I remember Pa teaching me about respect. He said that every creature, human or animal, deserved to be treated with dignity. That is why the horses trust me, because they know I respect them. Pa taught me that through his example, through how he treated Ma and all of us." Jake and Siki listened to their children, their eyes misty. When it was their turn to speak, Siki went first. "When I was dying in that snow, I had given up. I thought my story was over, that I would just be another Apache who disappeared, forgotten by the world. But then Jake found me. He did not have to stop. He could have kept riding. But he saw a human being in need, and he acted. That decision, that moment of compassion, created all of this." She gestured around the room at her family. "Every person in this room exists because one cowboy chose kindness over indifference. I want you all to remember that. Small acts of goodness can change the world." Jake cleared his throat, emotion thick in his voice. "Your mother saved me just as much as I saved her. Before I found her, I was going through the motions of life. The ranch was successful, but it was empty. She brought meaning and purpose and love. Our life together has not always been easy. People judged us. People said cruel things. But none of that mattered because we had each other. I want you all to know that love, real love, is worth fighting for. It is worth the difficulties and the challenges." Your mother and I built something true and lasting, and I hope you all find that same depth of connection in your own lives." The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then John stood and raised his glass. "To Ma and Pa, thank you for showing us what love, courage, and commitment look like. Thank you for building a family that honors both our heritages. Thank you for never giving up, even when the world made things hard." Everyone stood and toasted, and Siki leaned against Jake, his arm around her shoulders, surrounded by the family they had created against all odds. As the years continued their steady march, Jake and Siki grew old together gracefully. They took walks around the ranch each morning, slower now but still enjoying the land and each other's company. They spent hours on the porch, watching grandchildren play, sharing memories, and simply being together. When Jake was 70 and Siki 62, Jake's health began to fail. It started with a persistent cough that would not go away, then fatigue that kept him in bed more often. The doctor confirmed what Jake had suspected. His heart was giving out, worn down by decades of hard work and the natural progression of age. Jake faced his mortality with calm acceptance. He had lived a full, meaningful life. He had loved deeply and been loved in return. He had raised good children who were now raising good children of their own. He had built something that would last beyond his years. On a quiet evening in late autumn, as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, Jake and Siki sat together on their porch one last time. Jake's breathing was labored, his face pale, but he smiled at his wife. "I am not afraid," he told her. "I have had the most beautiful life. You gave me that." Siki's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I am not ready to let you go." "I know," Jake said gently, "but it is time. My body is tired, Siki. I have fought as long as I can." "What will I do without you?" Siki whispered. Jake cupped her face in his weathered hands. "You will live. You will watch our grandchildren grow. You will tell them stories about us, about how a cowboy and an Apache girl built a life together. You will honor what we had by continuing to live fully. Promise me." "I promise," Siki choked out. "I love you so much, Jake Morrison. You were my everything." "And you were mine," Jake replied. "4 winters, that is what you said, remember? 4 winters passed from the time I found you to when you became my wife. But we got so many more winters together after that. Beautiful winters. I have no regrets, my love, none at all." They sat together as the sun set, Jake's head resting against Siki's shoulder, her arms around him. And as the last light faded from the sky, Jake Morrison took his final breath, peacefully, surrounded by love. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Jake had been respected in the community despite his unconventional marriage, known for his fairness and honesty. Ranchers and cowboys, townspeople, and even some Apache who had known Siki's family all came to pay their respects. Siki stood at the graveside with her children and grandchildren around her, her face composed but her heart shattered. She placed her hand on the casket and whispered in Apache, a prayer for his journey, words of love that had no translation but needed none. In the weeks and months that followed, Siki grieved but also honored her promise to Jake. She remained active on the ranch, now fully run by John but still her home. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the day he had found her in the snow, about the life they had built together. She lived for another 8 years after Jake's death, years filled with the love of family. She saw great-grandchildren born, saw Sarah become principal of the San Angelo School, saw James train horses that became famous throughout Texas. When her time came, on a cold January day that reminded her of that long-ago blizzard, Siki passed peacefully in her sleep. She was buried next to Jake, their headstones side by side, marking the final resting place of a cowboy and his Apache wife who had defied convention and built a love story for the ages. At her funeral, Sarah stood before the gathered crowd and spoke. "My mother used to say that she was born twice. Once in an Apache village to her original parents, and again in that snow when my father found her and gave her a second chance at life. She made the most of that second chance. She loved fiercely, lived authentically, and never apologized for who she was. She and my father showed us that love can bridge any divide, that family is built not just on blood but on choice and commitment." Their story, from that rescue in the winter of 1878 to their final days together, is one of courage, determination, and enduring love. They rest together now, and I believe they are together still, wherever souls go when they leave this earth. The Morrison family continued to thrive for generations. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through John's line. Sarah's descendants became educators and lawyers, carrying forward her legacy of learning and justice. James's children continued his gift with horses, becoming renowned trainers. And always, the story was told and retold. The story of how a cowboy rescued a freezing Apache girl from a winter storm, how 4 winters later she became his beloved wife, and how together they had built a legacy of love that endured long after they were gone. Their story became part of the family's foundation, a reminder that the greatest things in life often come from moments of compassion, from seeing the humanity in others, from choosing love over fear. Jake and Siki Morrison had lived that truth, and in doing so had created something that would last forever. On the ranch, now run by their great-great-grandchildren, there is a special place under an old cottonwood tree where 2 headstones stand side by side. Visitors still come sometimes, people who have heard the story and want to pay their respects to the cowboy and the Apache girl whose love story defied the odds. The headstones are simple, bearing names and dates, but also a single line that Jake had requested before his death, words that summed up everything they had meant to each other. On his stone are the words he saved her life, and on hers, she saved his soul. Together in life, together in death, Jake and Siki Morrison's story stands as a testament to the power of love to overcome any obstacle, to bridge any divide, to create beauty from the most unlikely beginnings. Their legacy lives on not just in their descendants, but in the example they set, proving that when 2 people choose love with courage and commitment, they can build something truly extraordinary that echoes through time, inspiring all who hear their story to believe in the transformative power of choosing kindness, compassion, and love above all else.